Sometime last year, I read a book called The Blue Zones of Happiness. This came by recommendation of a friend of mine who had read it. And initially, when I looked at the cover of this book, I absolutely judged the contents of this book based off of its cover because it was something that looked almost spiritual to me. It's got this sort of blue sky with the sun is the dot for the eye and happiness. And the title of the book, The Blue Zones of Happiness, A Blueprint for a Better Life by Dan Buettner, was something that I looked at and I thought this is probably going to be a little hoity-toity and a little spiritual in ways that I'm not very spiritual. And I kind of dismissed it. But then I eventually read it, and it was one of the few books that I actually gave 5 stars to last year because it sort of spoke to me in a way that made a lot of empirical sense. And the author of The Blue Zones of Happiness goes in search of what makes happy places happy. And when I initially thought about this, I thought, well, that's surely about places like in, I don't know, small Nordic villages or something. But actually, this spanned the world over, including places like Singapore, Denmark, Costa Rica, and even places in the United States, including parts of Colorado. The Blue Zones was a designation for places where people seem to be the happiest for various different reasons, including their healthcare. It's empirical data that defines them. They've got access to good healthcare. They've got access to good social networks. They have access to good food, and it isn't necessarily related to whether or not those individuals have access to money. Because obviously in the United States, we start thinking about healthcare, we start thinking people who have money, we start thinking about having access to healthy, good, nutritious food. We start thinking again about money and having affluence to be able to afford those sorts of things. This is why I was interested in that particular book and why I thought it was so well put together, because they went and did research on people in places like Singapore and Costa Rica who are not at all wealthy, even in relation to the communities that they are in. And the whole book is well worth a read. That is not the topic of our discussion today, however. I only mention this because A, I liked that book, I enjoyed that book, and I think that everyone should read that book. In fact, it's one of the books that I end up gifting to people when I need to give somebody a gift, because I think that it's applicable to so many people. The book that we're talking about today, however, is called Ikigai, The Japanese Secret for a Long and Happy Life. It's by Walter Dixon, Francesc Morales, and Hector Garcia Puigver. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. The book, as you can guess, is focused almost entirely on the Japanese, and specifically, it's about the Japanese island of Okinawa, because supposedly the world's longest living people live in Okinawa. And the book is a little inspiring and it's a little comforting, but it's also touches a lot on the things that you would expect, including, if you're 100+ year old Japanese person and you wonder how do they live like that, and it's like, well, they stay active, they're not very sedentary, they eat well, and to the extent that they don't eat too much, they eat mostly plants, lots of sushi and fish, not a lot of pork or almost, I don't think, any red meat like beef or steak. And as I was listening to this book, which is very quick, it occurred to me that it overlapped a lot with the Blue Zones of Happiness. Now, when we think about the topic of this book, Ikigai, the Ikigai apparently is a Japanese word that means in so many words sort of what it is that gets you out of bed in the morning. It's your mission, your purpose in life. We talk a lot about this sort of crap incessantly in the West. It's things like vision and mission and purpose and passion. And I don't like any of those things. I have never liked any of those things. I find it bizarre and weird when people start thinking about their mission in life or their passion. I'm not a person that thinks most people have passions for things. I don't know. I look at the people who do, the kinds of jobs that most people end up doing. I don't know that I've ever met a mortician who was passionate about being a mortician. I don't know that I've ever met a person who, I don't know, is like an insurance agent who was passionate about insurance. I think they get into those sorts of lines of work because of lots of reasons, but passion's not one of them. Maybe their family was in that line of work. Maybe I've actually met several insurance agents over the years who got into insurance precisely because they thought that it would be a lucrative means to have income. It's not because they woke up one morning and they were just passionate about insuring people's cars or something. Anyway, Ikigai takes the approach that people have, a mission or a purpose in life. And the topics that were in this book touch on several other books that I've read over the years. I thought this would actually be relatively shallow. It's only 208 pages. The audiobook of this thing can be listened to in about, I think, 3 or 4 hours. It's almost like a long podcast, really. And there are several offshoots of this. Apparently, this was the original book. It was an international bestseller. They've since taken this approach to milking this thing for all it's worth, for probably very good reason, to have things like, guidebooks and exercises and workshops and these sorts of things. But the book was pretty good. I think that I would give it probably about 4 stars on this book. I think that you would like this book if you want something that's informative. It's inspiring, unlike a lot of the other books that I tend to read. This one's actually very inspiring. It's reflective. It's a little bit hopeful, and it's almost a little bit relaxing in some ways. I'd say it's a medium-paced book, maybe pretty fast-paced actually in parts. There's a chapter towards the end about doing things like yoga and Tai Chi that I kind of skipped over because it got into the weeds about how to do certain movements of things, and I just didn't really care to listen to that sort of thing or even read it. But let's dive into some of the topics about what this book promotes. One of the first things that this book promotes is accepting your emotions. This is apparently some Japanese proverbial stuff where you accept your emotions because they'll change based on your actions anyway. And so one of the examples that it gives is that, at least that I thought anyway, was if you imagine that you've gotten really angry at somebody like your partner or your spouse or a parent or a loved one or whoever, or even if somebody bumps into you on the street or whatever and you get angry at them, that just accept your emotion as being angry, and accept your emotion or about being sad or whatever it might be, because your emotion is going to change. Just recognize like, oh, I'm really mad right now, but I'm going to change this. I'm not going to always be mad about this, most likely. Or I'm not always going to be sad about this, most likely, because my actions of what I'm going to do next will change my output on this. So if somebody, bumps into your car and they put a big dent in the bumper and you get really mad at them, accept that you're mad at them, because the next thing you're going to do is you're going to swap insurance information and then you're going to get a new bumper and then life's going to go on, right? And so if you recognize the sort of output of that, that it can help you better, I guess I don't know that it's like help you understand your emotions more, but I suppose it could help you prepare, for the emotional ride that you're going to be on. Death is obviously one that we're probably more familiar with universally, that there's these stages of this that we go through, although there's some research that indicate that people don't really go through the 7 stages of grief in the same way that we all think that we do, but that by and large, our emotions are a part of our life. It's a very sort of Buddhist Zen way of approaching it, I suppose, to the extent that unlike controlling those emotions and not overreacting about those emotions, that we just accept them and recognize them and move on. The book also talks a little bit about the blue zones specifically, which is what really kind of piqued my interest in this book, because pretty on, they started doing some studies on the impact of the blue zones, which is an internationally recognized term for these places that promote a happier, long-living population of people. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I recommend that you read the book by Professor Buettner, because it's much more in-depth about that. The book also has some parts of it that are a little woo-woo for me. It asks at one point, what do we need to be doing right now? Dare to look into yourself. It's things like that that sort of turn me off a little bit. I'm not a particularly inward-looking person. I don't find that sort of spiritualness of things to sort of work for me in a useful way. But I get what it's trying to promote there. There are some other actions that it encourages people to take. One of which was kind of intense, actually, and it's sort of interesting because I have had this interest in trying to find sort of a Buddhist Vipassana retreat. And if you're not familiar with that, Vipassana is actually a really intense. I don't know that relaxation is quite the right word for it. It's almost like a sensory deprivation retreat. With Vipassana, you typically go to one of these retreat locations. Once you arrive there, you live very simply, very modestly. Your meals are prepared for you, but you don't talk to anybody. The only people that you can talk to are just sort of very short responses from either the retreat leader or some sort of monk, usually. It strikes me as an interesting experience, just to say that you've had the experience of doing it. But supposedly it's incredibly challenging. Most people break and crack under the pressure of it because they can't sort of go cold turkey on all of life's creature comforts and being able to communicate with people. The purpose of it is to, I guess, dare you to look into yourself and be inward about your own personality and who you are as an individual. One of the things that it suggests doing is isolating and resting for 5 to 7 days without stimuli. So that would include things like probably no spicy food, no highly flavored food, no smartphones, no television, no internet, no books, these sorts of things. Just that you're going to isolate yourself with no interaction from other people for 5 to 7 days. Probably spend a good chunk of that time napping, I'm guessing, because I don't know what else you would do. And just observe your emotions. And now, once you're bored with that, after 5 to 7 days, and we're talking about bored with sort of looking inward on yourself, not bored with the fact that you're not looking at Twitter, then you move on to a week of light occupational therapy, of repetitive tasks. This is things like introducing gardening or painting into your day, so that way you have something that is largely repetitive, but gives you something that you are creating or building there. Again, you're not talking to anybody during this period of time. And then after the occupational therapy comes some physical movement with things like chopping wood or making ceramics or pottery, things that are slightly more physical. I guess gardening could be physical depending on what you're gardening, but by and large, I think we're talking about small flower beds here or a small vegetable garden, and we're not talking about a small farm. And then lastly, after you've done that for another 5 or 7 days, that you return to social life and you maintain this practice of meditation that you developed during your treatment, and you re-enter as a new person without the social anxiety and stresses that you had going into this experience. I don't know if this is a particularly applicable thing for most people with jobs and kids and whatever to do at this, at that stretch for 5 to 7 days at a time for each of those phases. It adds up to about 3 weeks there. But you probably could do this in sort of a condensed version where if you took 5 or 7 days total and then did a day or two at each of those phases where you isolated without stimuli for a day or day and a half, and then you moved on to some light occupational therapy of the repetitive tasks like gardening or painting for a couple of days. And then at the end, you had this sort of physical movement of work with things like chopping wood or making ceramics or some other physical activity. I think light exercise could work into that. That you could do that over a period of 5 to 7 days. And then you would return to social life and sort of help to maintain that practice. It's I wrote it down because it seems doable. It seems achievable. It seems hard. And so that sort of stuff appeals to me in that sense. I can also imagine that for a lot of people, that seems like a terrible idea and not worth doing at all, but to each their own. There was a quote in the book about Aristotle saying that we are what we repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence is a habit. And I liked the thinking behind that because I have been thinking a lot lately about how to sort of pursue excellence in the work that I do, and recognizing that there are limits to this with both my skill and time and money, recognizing that there are sort of social limits or cultural limits on certain things. For example, it's hard to just run out and make random friends, and People can't just run out and not be depressed anymore. They can't run out and not be anxious anymore. There are outside external forces on all of us for various things, but that excellence is therefore something that we could perhaps cultivate, and that being truly excellent at our work is sort of developing a set of habits or patterns that we do that would sort of set us up for that. That's something that I jotted down because I wanted to give it more thought, and it's something that I continue to sort of chew on in the back of my mind. But the book goes on from there to sort of talk about some strategies for doing that, including things that we've talked about in other books and other shows before, including monotasking, not being multi-threaded in our approach to things, that we should recognize that we are not computers, that we cannot do multitasking to the extent that computers do, and therefore that we should focus on one thing at a time before moving on to the next thing and sort of clump like projects together. As an example of this, if you've got 2 or 3 clients that you're working with and you have a little bit of work to do for each of them, and you also have some emails to do for each of them, that you should do all of the work for each client individually, including the emails and the responses and the meetings or whatever that you have to do with those folks before moving on to the next. That you shouldn't do work for one and then work for the other and then do some emails that go to both and then go to the third project, do some work for there, and then email that person. You should monotask all of those things. It also touches on flow state, which there's a TED Talk by this fella who I believe he is, I think, Turkish, maybe. Let me look this up real fast. This is going to make for some really, this makes for some good audio here. Because his name is an incredible mix of characters that almost looks like it doesn't have any vowels in it. I'm going to try and pronounce this. It's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. If you looked at the name, you would also fall over it, probably worse than I did there. I believe he's since deceased, but he gave a TED Talk about flow state, which he argued was the secret to happiness. In this book, Ikigai talks a little bit about this too, and about how to get into flow state. And flow state is simply just a period of time where we've all experienced this from time to time, where you sort of get into a project in such a way that time seems to melt away and you don't actually recognize or feel like you're working. That is sort of the ideal scenario to get into. The book also touches on some things that are a little more superficial, I guess. They asked people, the researchers, I assume they're researchers, asked people living in Okinawa sort of what their credo is, what their advice is for people who want to be a centenarian and live to be over 100 or 100 plus years old. And some of the things they said were things like, don't worry, smile, just sort of, cultivate good habits. But some of the things that they also talked about are things that have been a little more top of mind to me lately. This includes eat mostly plants, avoid a lot of the heavy meat that is typical in a Western diet. They also say, there was a woman who said, go out and see people on the street and say hello, and just sort of to cultivate a sense of community and network that way. I like that idea. I just think that in a lot of American cities, particularly if you're in a rural area, that might be incredibly hard to do. And even if you did, people might look at you kind of funny. I don't know. Maybe maybe it's something similar that you could, I don't know, say hi to the person you're standing in front of at the coffee shop or something. They also suggest spending time together with people and having fun. Again, that's much more top of mind to me because I think about this a lot, and I think about sort of the social problems that people have increasingly in this country, in America, where particularly men just don't seem to have much of a network to allow them to do those sorts of things. That increasingly the closest people in our lives are often our spouses and our children. And if you don't have children or you don't have a spouse, then that can get pretty bleak pretty quickly. And I think that cultivates a lot of mental stress and anxiety and depression in our society. They also talk about, again, gardening. It's a sense of having an activity. It also gives you some mental work as well and keeps your body moving, but it also gives you healthy food to eat. A lot of the people they spoke to in Okinawa suggested that part of their success in longevity was simply due to the fact that they ate a lot of vegetables and they grew their own food, and that almost everything they ate was something that they either grew themselves or that they got fish from the fish market and they knew their fishmonger and they had known them for years. Uh, it's something like that, I think, is almost impossible for a lot of people in Western societies, particularly in America. I don't know that there's a lot of people who can have access to that sort of thing. Like if the only thing in your community is a Walmart, and that's where you get your food because it's the only place that has food, I don't know how you're supposed to, get around that. I mean, I guess you could grow some food for some of the year, but I think for a lot of people it could be challenging, particularly in the Midwest here where I live, to how do you grow food year round? It's January and it's like 10 degrees outside right now. I don't know what grows in that sort of environment. So I think that there's part of this that, I mean, I guess you could do it the way we all did as pioneers, but I don't know that that's a step up for most people. That may almost be too much effort to the extent that it drains people from being able to cultivate other experiences, or even earn money to afford, I don't know, sending their kids to school or something. They talk a lot about going for a walk, and walking is, fantastic exercise for people to the extent that it's good for your mind and good for your body in ways that I don't even know that science and medicine even fully understand yet. Drink tea, particularly green and white teas, because of their antioxidants. Apparently, they talked to a lot of folks on the island of Okinawa who were adamant that drinking tea was an excellent way to maintain their longevity and their health. They also talk about exercise. They don't talk about it in the extent that exercise is commonly done here in the United States. In the United States and parts of the West, exercise is a thing that we tend to block together, for an hour or something at the beginning or the end of our day. Usually it's an incredibly intense bit of exercise with either extreme weightlifting or high intensity training or cardio or something like that, or that you go to the gym and you get on the treadmill for an hour. The folks that they spoke to said that they don't really ever do that, and it's probably for the best, because quite frankly, I think that at some point in the future, it would not be unreasonable that science will tell us that maybe if you sit around for most of the day and then get up for an hour in a huge burst of activity, that probably isn't great. It's probably incredibly hard on your body. The kinds of work that we do in the West to sort of cram in as much work as we possibly can within that hour is probably detrimental to us, simply because it's hard on our knees and hard on our joints and hard on our muscles. I think that for most people, most of the time, it's probably not ideal. I say that as a person who does exactly that every day, and I enjoy doing that every day. But the kind of work that the folks in Okinawa talk about, we're just doing things like lifting their arms above their heads. And apparently this gets back to sort of our, caveman ancestors, where we would be picking fruit off of the trees and we'd be reaching up and keeping our arms above our heads. And they talk about just doing some simple things like that with some exercises where they sort of wave their arms up above their head and do some stretches. They talked to people who do things like yoga and Tai Chi, and then they would go for a walk. And that was their exercise, and that they were in great shape because of it. Do they get the sort of bodies that we sort of aesthetically crave in the West, with defined six-pack abs and bulging muscles and, petite definitions around hips and breasts and those sorts of things? I doubt it. But then again, if you're 100, you don't really have those things anyway. They probably don't care about those things. But it occurs to me that, the kind of exercise that they were doing was probably more than enough, and probably is something that we could or should be doing in the West, but we aren't. Increasingly, it's just very hostile to even walk places in the West. The book even suggests, like walk to work or something. And I think for a lot of people, it's like, yeah, well, it takes me an hour to drive there. So I'm definitely not going to be walking, clear across town. But that's a failure of our culture and a failure of our ability to sort of design cities with that sense of community in mind. And they talk a lot about the communities of things. They talk about belonging to a neighborhood association where they feel cared for and respected. They gave a lot of thought in the book to community centers. And when I think of community centers, and I think when most of us in America think of community centers, we think of a dank place where we don't even know who the people are that go to community centers. Like, there's lots of community centers in the United States, and it feels like it's for people maybe old people, I guess, or that they go there for very rudimentary classes and things that seem like if you're a highly educated or overeducated white collar worker, the idea of going to a community center probably seems completely useless to you. But they talk about how they go to the community centers and they belong to neighborhood associations where they feel cared for and respected. They talk about how their neighborhood associations would band together to loan people money. They'd all sort of, compile into a big fund of money. And if you had a financial crisis or something, that you could borrow money out of it, or that you could just take money out of it. And that everybody knew that at some point they themselves would also probably need to do the same. And so the community would support you in those endeavors. They talk too a little bit about remembering your ancestors. And I think about this a lot too, because I have a keen interest in history and a keen interest in genealogy. They talked about recognizing the connection between people and remembering what their ancestors had gone through. And I suspect that in Japan, particularly in Okinawa, that the people that they're talking to have very keen and astute observations and memories from the war and from times that were far worse even before that. And they try to recognize the connection between people to say, so in so many words, I am here because my father and mother were here, and my father and mother were here because these two people did these other two things, and they came together, and that's what begat them, and that's what begat me. And I think that's important to at least understand. I think it's important for people to at least have a sense of where they come from and what their ancestors endured, to sort of give you perspective on what your life is like today. One of the more remarkable things in this book, I think, they talked about always being busy, even when relaxing. And if you're like me, you probably, I would consider myself a pretty busy guy. I like to stay active. I like to continue to do things. And I'm often told from people who are around me sometimes that I'm a little intense in that regard. And that it would be nice sometimes if we just sort of sat down and just did nothing. The thing is that they argue that they don't ever do that. They don't ever sort of sit on the porch and just sort of blankly stare out at the world. That they're always active, that they're always busy even when they're relaxing. And so their relaxation may be that they are, sitting at home quietly or something, but they are cleaning, or they are knitting, or they're doing some gardening, or going for a walk or something. That they never just sort of sit down and loaf around. And that was both interesting to me because it sort of validated my point of view, but also because it strikes me as a sense of wisdom in that. It strikes me as though that never sitting alone and doing nothing is worth striving for. They also talk a lot about diet, the diets that they eat. Always encourage eating the rainbow. They have a term, hara hachibu, and that apparently translates roughly eat until you're 80% full. The idea is that you should stop eating when you're still a little bit hungry, and that you can achieve this by serving yourself on multiple small plates. They talk about how a lot of these folks have culturally on the island, and it makes them unique in Japan compared to even other Japanese folks, but that the people of Okinawa consistently eat, the fresh fruits and vegetables that they grow and seafood, and very rarely pork, maybe just 1 or 2 times a week, and not very much of it, but that they serve themselves on many small plates, sort of like tapas, I guess, but that instead of serving themselves on one large plate, they might have 5 much smaller plates, which looks like a lot more food. There just isn't that much on each of the plates. The result is that it sort of slows them down in their eating process, and that they drop about 1/3 of the food that they would ordinarily eat off the plate. And by doing so, they're always 80% full. This usually means that they forego having a dessert, for example, like we would consider having as part of a Western diet. Actually, as part of a Western diet, we would probably eat a full plate of food and then sort of cram in a dessert at the end. They're talking about not doing that at all, that eating until you're 80% full, because that you'll feel healthier later, but also because digestion is a pretty aggressive process in our bodies. It sort of saps our energy. Our bodies tend to focus a lot of energy on dealing with digestion. And if you eat to the extent that you're only 80% full, you give your body some time to digest peacefully, calmly, without that sort of aggressive attack that it has to do in a lot of Western diets when you just sort of eat so much that you're like, oh my God, I can't even move. That they don't do that. And that seems like a smart bit of advice. They also talk about doing 2 days of fasting each week. When I hear fasting, I think that you don't eat anything, that maybe you just drink some water or something. But they talk about how 2 days of the week, not necessarily consecutively, that they eat under 500 calories a day. And, for most of us, that's probably like saying, let's eat, a breakfast or a breakfast size meal at some point throughout the day. And that's it. And I don't know what to think about fasting. I researched this a lot and I come away not really understanding the science behind it, or if there's value to it, or if it's just sort of a cockamamie idea. The idea of doing 2 days a week where you're eating under 500 calories a day seems much more doable to me. Maybe something that I would consider trying at some point. This is not great to do if you're the sort of person that gets hangry a lot, but it might be worth considering for you. I suppose you could also get 500 calories by doing a couple of juices. That if you had a juice in the morning or midday, and then another one towards the end of the day, that would sort of maybe keep you satiated enough that you didn't think about it. It's also important, I think, this is me talking, it's also important that if you're going to do fasting, that you have lots of things on the calendar for that day that sort of keep you busy and keep your mind off the fact that you're probably hungry. Why they do the 2 days of fasting each week, I'm not really sure. The book doesn't really dive into that. I tend to think that maybe that comes from a point of economic depression and lack of resources, and that they did this for survival, and that they just sort of continued to do it because that's what they did when they were children, or when they were growing up in sort of a post-war Japanese economy. I don't know. One of the things that goes unaddressed in this book is healthcare. At no point in this book did the authors ever dive into what Japanese healthcare was like. And I actually don't really know what Japanese healthcare is like. I'm going to assume that Japanese healthcare is like sort of a national healthcare program, and that they don't have the stupid problems that we have in America with our healthcare system, where you have to have insurance, and even when you do, you're still probably screwed. And so that never gets addressed. I wish they would have addressed it. I don't know if the people that they spoke to, who were over 100 plus years old, were routinely taking medical care of some kind. My guess is maybe not. It seems like if they were taking prescription medications, that would have come up in their research, and they would have mentioned that for the simple fact that it would have been the right thing to mention. But I don't know. So it went unaddressed in the book. I wish they'd had answered that. If they were sitting here in front of me right now, I would ask the authors what they knew about Japanese healthcare and how that impacted the people that they were studying. But towards the very, very end of the book, they also talked about getting rid of things that make you feel fragile, or that make you fragile. I made the note that this could be things like removing snacks from your house because it makes your willpower fragile to resist eating junk food. Removing debt or toxic people from your life because those things add a sense of fragility into your life, because your income or your emotions can be negatively impacted by those outside forces. It talks about resilience in sort of a modern pop psychology standpoint, that it's becoming much more interesting to people to understand resilience and how we build resilient cities and resilient communities and so forth. What has never really been discussed, that I've discovered anyway, is that there's not a lot of talk about resilience for individuals and how individuals can improve their resilience. They do this in a roundabout way in the book by talking about how to get rid of things that otherwise make you feel fragile, or that make you actually fragile, I should say. Anyway, the book is called Ikigai, Ikigai, The Japanese Secret to a Long and Happy Life, by Walter Dixon, Francesc Morales, and Hector Garcia Puigcerver. And it's an interesting book. I give it 3.75 stars. We can round up to say 4 stars on this. You'll like this book if you like something that's informative, something that's inspiring or reflective, a little bit hopeful, and a little bit relaxing. Worth checking out because it also pulls together topics and nuggets from several other books and other psychological theories that are all very interesting and are all, I think, rooted in a seed or a kernel of truth that we should all be exploring in much more depth.